And welcome back. David Cameron told MPs this week that he felt physically ill at the thought of giving prisoners the vote. But he conceded that his government has no choice but to comply with a European human rights ruling demanding the lifting of the UK's 140-year-old blanket ban. Ministers threw in the towel following advice that non-compliance could leave the taxpayer facing a £160 million bill for compensation. As election law is reserved to Westminster, the SNP government is powerless to prevent inmates of Scottish jails rejoining the democratic process. However, the Justice Secretary, Kenny McCaskill, expressed his dismay at the prospect.
If you're going to prison, then it should be for a serious offence, and if you commit a serious offence, then I think society's entitled to record its opprobrium, and that includes the right to vote.
Well, to debate the fallout from this week's developments, we are now joined by the Conservative MSP Bill Aitken and the co-leader of the Scottish Green Party, Patrick Harvie. Patrick Harvie, this all starts from a case in 2005, and the UK government have known about the ruling for quite some time. Shouldn't the previous government have really take some of the blame for not addressing this issue sooner?
Well, I think so, and a number of people, including MPs in the last session of the Westminster Parliament, were raising this issue and saying, don't you have to shift your ground? And I'm afraid they were resolutely saying no. You know, there is an element of this which I know is going to be unpopular, but one of the things we have to remember is that human rights law is there for everybody, and it's meaningless if we pick and choose who gets to appeal on grounds of human rights. It needs to be a universal application, and you know, it's only in countries which have an appalling human rights record, far worse than in this country, where prisoners don't have any recourse to law when they feel that they've been denied their rights in jail.
Well, Bill Aitken, the prisoner who took the case upon which the 2005 judgment is based, said, and I quote, "All prisoners can do is riot if they've got a complaint, so you have to give them this legitimate channel." Isn't that a fair point?
No, it's a quite spurious argument. If prisoners have a grievance, there are all sorts of well-established systems for registering these grievances. In Scotland, for example, we have the HM Inspector of Prisons, who frequently takes up the complaints of prisoners. This is just an absolutely facile argument, and once again, Scotland's law is being made to look ridiculous by European legislation.
Now, we already know, Patrick Harvie, that the government is saying, well, of course, it's not going to apply to all prisoners, but in a sense, isn't that dangerous? Because if you decide what the cut-off point is, does that not invite further challenges under the same legislation?
Well, I think that would be a risk. Kenny McCaskill, in the clip that you showed just a moment ago, talked about certain offences, serious offences, being a reason to withdraw the right to vote. Other people have talked about you know, whether it should be prison or not. You know, we're using prison for fewer and fewer of the less serious offences. Why is prison the cut-off point? Others have talked about whether someone is likely to be at liberty during the term of office that's being elected. So if someone's in prison for a few months and it happens to fall on the election day,
all prisoners should be given the vote. That way it's an absolutely sort of clean right.
Well, it certainly seems a more straightforward way to me, and it does seem bizarre to me that we're talking specifically about the right to vote as though it's some sort of totemic issue. No one's talking about taking away the right for prisoners to be represented by their MP, their MSP over some issues, and prisoners do sometimes contact them. Why is it the right to vote is being taken away? I think enforcing the right to vote sends a signal you are part of society and you've got obligations to society.
Well, I can tell you that in the last 2 weeks I have replied to correspondence from prisoners in various institutions in Scotland, so they do have the right, which I recognise and I respond to. But frankly, no prisoners should have the right to vote. When you are locked up, it's a sign of society's disapproval and being disenfranchised.
David Cameron's going to give them the vote. Not all of them, but he's going to give some of them the vote.
David Cameron has been forced into it by the European legislation,
but
to which the Labour government, just let me finish for a second, Patrick, which the Labour government signed up to in 1998. Kenny McCaskill, I totally agreed with what he said tonight, but he was in favour of signing up to that legislation. Patrick, from his position, and I quite understand it, was in favour of it as well, the Liberal Party. Only the Conservatives have actually pointed out the way in which this could prejudice the Scottish legal system.
Well, yes, I'm glad that it's only the Conservatives who would leave us without proper human rights law, but there is a kind of illogic in Bill Aitken's position. If he's serious about society sending a message that the right to vote is totemic of having behaved well in society and a criminal offence should take that away, why isn't he talking about people on community service? Why doesn't he want to take away the right to vote from people while they're paying off their fines? You know, if we follow that logic through, we would end up in a situation like America, where you have huge swathes of people, usually poorer people, disenfranchised, and that situation is manipulated by right-wing politicians.
Well, in soft-touch Scotland, it's almost impossible to get the jail, quite frankly. We heard what Sheriff Lindsay Fowler said last week when dealing with a case, that someone going to prison is out within a few weeks, despite the sentence of being 6 months. So it's ludicrous. There has got to be a cut-off point, and the custody is that.
Let me ask you both
point.
a question, a more general point. Last week we were discussing the implications of the Cadder case. This week it is voting. Isn't the European Convention of Human Rights now frankly seeping into so many areas of law that sovereign countries are effectively not being able to set their own priorities, Patrick Harvie?
Human rights does apply to many aspects of life, and it's right that it should. I think this country should be proud of its contribution to developing international human rights law, not nervous about implementing it here at home. And the deeper question, why aren't we debating the prison conditions that would give people a better chance of rehabilitation, a better chance of changing their behaviour, rather than this one totemic issue of whether a handful of them might choose to vote?
On the general issue of ECHR?
It has been a disaster for Scotland.
Nonsense.
It has cost us millions of pounds. It has sought to mend a system that is not broken.
Should the coalition government just try and seek to disentangle it from a constitutional law?
I think that this has got to happen.
So
it's very, very difficult. Without breaching one's treaty obligations, it is quite difficult to do.
But in your world, we wouldn't have human rights law.
If you look at the amount of money that this has cost, we all believe in human rights. We resolutely believe in human rights. But I resent being equated with a country like Turkey, which has an appalling human rights record. And that basically, last week's events were caused by the Saldus appeal, as you know, Patrick, which was correctly upheld by the European Court. But to equate Scotland and our systems with Turkey is nonsense.
Human rights have to be universal or they mean nothing. And to say that human rights can apply in Turkey but not in this country is meaningless.
OK, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Well, it's time now to get the lowdown on some of the other issues that have been making waves this week in politics.